Katherine Favor is an agroforestry researcher, educator, and outreach professional dedicated to helping people regeneratively steward farms, ranches, and forests. She has worked for the National Center for Appropriate Technology, ATRA, the United States Peace Corps, and several other environmental organizations, where she has provided technical assistance, training, and education to farmers and ranchers to help them scale the adoption of agroforestry and other climate beneficial practices. Before working at NCAT, Katherine received her master's in agroforestry from the University of Missouri, and she managed an organic vineyard and community forest garden in San Diego. We at the USVG have gotten to know Katherine and NCAT through some collaborative urban agriculture projects that we've done together over the years. We have worked together to develop a greenhouse manual for educators, both with NCAT and our partners at City Blossoms here in DC. We've collaborated to offer Arm to Urban Farm trainings in several cities across the country for veterans who are interested in learning to farm in urban settings. And then most recently with our speaker, Katherine, we've been collaborating on some new resources in urban agroforestry, which is a topic we're really excited to be learning more about today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Katherine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Emily, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am so excited to be here with you all today talking about one of my favorite topics in the world, community forest gardens, and how they can build community resilience and also climate resilience for our environment as a whole. Like Emily said, I did used to help manage an urban forest garden in San Diego. And thanks to USVG and the National Agroforestry Center, I got to dive into this topic even further. Over the past 2 years, I got the chance to research and explore over a dozen different forest gardens throughout the US and learn from their best practices and what's worked for them. And it's just been amazing and so inspiring to see. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what forest gardens are and ways that you can implement them in your communities if you're interested in that. So Emily already introduced me, so we'll just dive into our intentions for today. First, we're going to talk about forest gardens or food forests in general, what they are. You're going to hear me use the terms food forest and forest gardens kind of interchangeably. It's the same thing, just a different term. People have different preferences when they use that term, but we're going to be talking about what they are, what they look like, and some of the ecological design principles behind their design. We're also going to be talking about the benefits of community forest gardens in terms of their benefits to the environment and also just to communities and to people. We're also going to be talking about ways to engage and educate the community if you have a forest garden in a community setting. Some of the challenges, we'll touch upon those, and then we'll also go through steps for how to start a forest garden in your community. So setting the stage, I kind of want to zoom out and talk about agroforestry in general. Some of you may have heard this word, agroforestry. It's kind of an umbrella term, and forest gardens fall under that umbrella term. So I wanted to talk about that first. Agroforestry is simply defined as the intentional integration of trees into cropping systems. So it could be trees integrated into livestock systems or cropping systems. And it's different from the traditional farming systems that we might usually see if we're driving down the road in Iowa, for instance. A lot of our farming systems in the US are monocultures, and that means one crop planted over and over and over, nothing else, no diversity. For example, you might see acres of corn, just acres of corn one after another, or acres of strawberries. Monocultures are just one crop, so very low diversity. And there are some, benefits to that kind of system and also a lot of challenges. And then kind of moving up the chain of diversity, we've got polyculture systems, which would be 2 or more crops in a single system. So that could be, for example, like wheat intercropped with another crop, or corn intercropped with beans. So a little bit more diversity there. And then with agroforestry, we are looking at trees integrated into cropping systems. So even more diversity. And there are so many different ways that you could integrate trees into a cropping system. You could organize your trees on a farm in so many different ways. We tend to kind of categorize those ways into 6 broad categories, or what we call practices, Really, in reality, there are dozens of different ways that you could arrange trees onto a farm. But we're just going to be talking about a few. Forest gardens are one of those ways. But there are many others. Windbreaks, that would be arranging trees on the edges of your farm to kind of slow down wind. Alley cropping is when rows of trees are intercropped with rows of a crop underneath. Silvopasture would be the integration of trees into a livestock system. Forest farming is when you have a mature overstory forest and you plant an understory crop beneath that. Riparian forest buffers are when you integrate trees and shrubs alongside waterways. And then forest gardens, that's what we're here to talk about today. Forest gardens are multiple layers of vegetation that's edible and medicinal. So we're going to dive right into that, into what forest gardens or food forests are. So they're defined as landscapes with multiple vertical layers of edible, medicinal, or otherwise useful vegetation, and they're designed to mimic the structure and function of early succession forests. So what is an early succession forest? Well, succession just means change over time. And so you can have young forests and you can have older forests, and they're going to have a different look and feel and function. So on the left, you can see a picture of a mature forest. So we can take a look at this picture and see what's going on. As you can see, you've got really tall, big trees. They have big canopies, so there's hardly any light that's reaching the understory layers, very, very densely spaced, right? And you can see there is diversity, but there's not a ton. There are just about 2 different layers of vertical vegetation here. You've got your big, tall trees, just a few species of conifers maybe, and then below we can see we've got some ferns and some moss, so just maybe 1 or 2 or 3 species in that understory layer. So that's an incredible system, incredible ecosystem, but it's very different from what an early succession forest looks like. Early succession forests, that would be this picture on the right. You can see the trees are a little bit more widely spaced. You've got a little bit more variety when it comes to the type of vegetation in the system. You can see there are some conifers, some deciduous trees, some shrubs, and then you've got grasses, you've got some forbs. You've kind of got these different layers of vegetation. And you can see that there is more light. There's a higher amount of light. And there's at least some light that's reaching kind of all those different layers of vegetation. So 2 incredibly important ecosystems, but very different ecosystems. And when we are looking to create forest gardens, we are looking to mimic the structure and function of these early succession forests, more so than the mature forests. So if you kind of blur your vision and you can look at these 2 pictures, on the left, we have an early succession forest. And on the right, we have a picture of a forest garden. This is a forest garden right in San Diego called Coastal Roots Farm. And if you kind of blur your vision, you can see that they have a similar structure and function, except for in the case of forest gardens, all of the vegetation is either edible, medicinal, or otherwise useful to humans in some way. But you can see that there are different types of trees, high levels of diversity. There's some shade for sure, but there's some amount of light that's reaching kind of all these different multiple layers of vegetation. So that is what we're going for when we are designing forest gardens. And we can think about it, a lot of forest gardens have up to 8 different vertical layers of vegetation. There's no recipe, so you don't have to have 8 layers by any means, but you could have up to 8 different layers. And we're just going to kind of go over these layers. You could have a layer of overstory canopy trees. These are your taller trees, and they function to provide shade to the understory below. It could be, they're often nut-producing trees, so it could be things like chestnuts or pecans or walnuts or big mulberry trees, things like that. Then the next kind of vertical layer down would be your understory trees. And these are shorter trees, kind of medium-sized trees. They're often fruit-producing species in forest gardens. So it could be things like apples or pears or oranges, things like that. Then the next layer down, we've got our shrub layer, and those are our woody bushes and shrubs and even brambles. So you could have blackberries or raspberries or medicinal species like agarita. You could have native shrubs like coyote brush. There are so many different shrubs that you could have in this layer. And then the next layer down would be your herbaceous crop layer. Those are shorter, more shade tolerant or shade obligate plants. So those are plants that either tolerate shade or need shade to thrive. And this layer, we're looking to produce food primarily. So it could be things like broccoli, kale, asparagus, squashes, pumpkins, things like that. And then we've got a vine layer, and a vine layer, vines typically climb up the other vertical species in a forest garden. So they typically climb up your shrub layer or your trees, and they use those woody components as their trellis. We've also got a ground cover layer. And so ground cover, that's the sprawling kind of low-lying vegetation that covers the ground. It could produce food as well. It could be something like sprawling oregano or sprawling strawberry, something that is covering the ground and functioning to keep it moist, keep it covered, suppress weeds, while also producing food. We've also got a root layer. So that could be your root crops like carrots, onions, peppers, radishes, and they function to produce food, but they also function to kind of break up compaction in the soil and also feed a healthy soil microbiome through root exudates or plant sugars that go through the roots. You could also have a fungal layer. So again, there's no recipe. You don't need to have 8 layers, but this is just kind of showing you that you could have up to 8 layers in a forest garden. This is just another example. You can see there's a high amount of diversity. Diversity is definitely the defining feature of a forest garden. And each layer has an ecological function. Really, when we're designing forest gardens, we're looking to create an ecosystem that all functions together in balance. So each layer has an ecological function. It has a service that it's providing to all of the other plants in the ecosystem. So we kind of went over this, but that overstory tree layer, it functions to provide shade. So this can be really important, especially if you're growing in an area that has hot summers, like here in San Diego. An example of an overstory tree would be a pecan. And pecans provide a lot of shade during the heat of summer. They can reduce the temperatures in the microclimate by up to 15 degrees, which really can allow you to produce food in the understory that you might not otherwise be able to produce if you didn't have that shade and that cooling effect. But then those pecans lose their leaves in the winter, which allows light to come through when you are not needing that temperature reduction. Another thing that trees do in this layer, trees can actually protect understory crops from extreme cold as well. So they function similar to rocks. They absorb heat from the sun during the day, and then they actually can radiate that heat out to understory layers at night. And so in certain times of year, that can help protect your understory layers from frost damage. And then trees also serve to cycle nutrients. So trees, as we know, have really, really deep root systems, and they can take in nutrients from those deep layers, draw them up through their system to produce leaves. Those leaves will eventually fall off in the form of leaf litter and decompose and feed the other understory plants around them. So those are some of the ecological functions that the overstory tree layer can provide. The understory tree layer, this tree layer really serves to produce a large amount of food for your forest garden, and it helps take advantage of that vertical space because you've got multiple layers of vegetation. So that can help you produce a large amount of food in a small unit of area. And that's super important, especially if you're growing in an urban environment where you might have less space. It's really great to be able to take advantage of your vertical space. Shrub layers, their ecological function is also to produce a lot of fruit and medicinal products. A lot of shrubs also can fix nitrogen. So if you choose shrubs that are leguminous, they are actually able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a solid form in the soil that can kind of fertilize other plants around them. So this can help you reduce your dependence on chemical fertilizers, which is really important. It helps create just a closed loop system that's less dependent on inputs. Similarly, a lot of shrubs, if they're flowering shrubs, if they're native shrubs, they can serve to attract beneficial insects and pollinators. Pollinators are super important, as we know, to produce fruit. We need pollinators to help us turn flowers into fruit. And so by attracting those pollinators and providing a pollen source for them year-round, we can really help support the health of our forest gardens as a whole. The ecological function of the herbaceous layer is to produce a lot of food for humans. And then the ground cover layer, like we kind of talked about, it functions to keep the ground cool and moist. This is really important to have a healthy microbiome in your soil. Microbes like having a cool and moist environment. And so when you keep the ground covered, it helps them thrive. And also the ground cover layer suppresses weeds, which is really, really important. So these are just some of the ecological functions of each of these forest layers. And you can they all work together like different pieces of a puzzle to create an ecosystem that's greater than the sum of its parts. So like I mentioned, each layer has this ecological function, and we're trying to increase the synergistic interactions between these layers. But that being said, there will always be some competition between layers, especially because they're really going to be packed together in a forest garden. So you are going to have competition between your species for resources like light and water and nutrients. But there are things that we can do, species that we can select to minimize that competition and to maximize the beneficial interactions. So we're going to kind of get into some of those tactics for doing that. But first, I do just want to acknowledge that forest gardens, this way of arranging trees and plants in multiple layers, this is not a new practice by any means. Forest gardens are an ancient practice, and indigenous cultures have been planting and tending forest gardens for thousands of years and up to today. So I like to say they're an ancient solution to a modern problem. Today, we are starting to implement forest gardens in our urban areas because they are a really great solution to produce a lot of food and bring the community together. So they're new in the sense that they are new in urban areas, but the practice itself is an indigenous practice that's been done for thousands of years. And in fact, fun fact, there's evidence that huge parts of the forests in British Columbia and the Amazon rainforest are actually forest gardens that were intentionally planted by indigenous people. So they removed trees that were not useful and they planted trees that were useful in some way, maybe trees that produced food or forage for animals, or that produced cordage or some other firewood, some other benefit. And so the landscape throughout large parts of North and South America, it's actually just really big forest gardens. So that's kind of neat, and something to acknowledge that we're just drawing from this ancient wisdom when we are creating forest gardens. So now that we kind of know what forest gardens are, what they look like, what they function like, we can get into some of these strategies for creating these ecosystems that are in balance. And a big factor is species selection. So when we are selecting species, there are a lot of different things that we should be thinking about. No matter what, usually a goal of forest gardens is to produce a lot of food for the community. And so it's important to plant, primarily food and medicine producing plants that are useful to people. It's also important to plant plants that your community is actually going to want to use. So for example, you wouldn't want to plant your forest garden with only obscure herbs that, people aren't really familiar with. Obscure herbs are super cool, but it's important to have plants in your forest garden that the community actually is going to utilize. And so it's important to get feedback from your community about what they want to see in their forest gardens. Another thing to think about, it's important to plant plants that produce at different times of the year so that you can have a year-round harvest. So when we're thinking about trees, for example, you might want to plant an apple tree that's going to produce in the fall, and a nectarine that's going to produce in the summer, and maybe some citrus that'll produce in the winter. Just something that's going to produce at different times of the year so that you'll always have something ready and ripe. And similarly, we also want to select plants that are going to flower at different times of the year so that we can provide a food source to pollinators and beneficial insects year round and keep our ecosystem healthy and functioning. Native plants are always a good option. Native and naturalized plants, they're adapted to your growing region. They tend to be resilient and less reliant on inputs. So those are always my first go-to plants. If you can plant natives, do it. Like I kind of mentioned, it might be good to have some nitrogen fixing plants in the mix to add some soil fertility to your system so that you don't need to constantly be adding fertilizer or compost. Similarly, nutrient accumulator plants are really important to think about adding. Those are plants that draw nutrients from deep in the ground and create a lot of mulch to feed other surrounding layers. Comfrey is a good example, and then any tree would be a good example of that. And then, like I mentioned, thinking about where you might need shade in your forest garden, where you might need wind protection, and kind of selecting species for that function. Other things to think about when you're selecting species, no matter what, you are going to want to plant species that are adapted to your climate and your growing region. So if you're not already familiar with your plant hardiness zone, that's definitely a tool that I highly recommend using. Plant hardiness zone, that just refers to the average minimum temperature in your area. And if you don't know what planting zone you're in, you can just go to USDA has a plant hardiness zone map, and you can enter in your address and it'll tell you what your plant hardiness zone is. And then you can actually just select plants that are adapted to that specific temperature range. So that's number one. I would do that as a first step. Knowing your first and last frost date and your altitude is also really important. If you're not aware of that in your growing region, you can type in your address to the Farmer's Almanac and it'll tell you all of that info. Another really, really great tool. And then, of course, knowing your precipitation, your average rainfall month by month, that's really important too when you're selecting species. So NOAA, that's the website that I go to get precipitation info. For example, I live in San Diego, and so we get on average 13 inches of rain a year. So I'm going to want to try to plant drought-resistant plants in a forest garden. It would not be good for my water bill if I were planting a ton of tropical plants in my forest garden, and vice versa. If I were in a tropical area, you wouldn't want to plant a lot of desert plants. It just wouldn't make sense. Another thing to think about when we're selecting our species for our forest gardens is your soil type. No matter what, before beginning a project, I always recommend doing a soil test. It's really easy. It's relatively cheap. It costs around $45, and you can get an idea of what nutrients are in your soil. And another great tool is Web Soil Survey. This is a tool, you don't have to do anything. You can just go online. It's a tool from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and you can just type in your address and get a ton of great info about the soil in your region. You can get info on the available water holding capacity, the pH, the organic matter, even slope. It's just an incredible tool, and it's free and it's just online. So once we do that, once we think about our climate and our growing context and our goals, now it comes time to actually deciding which species we want to plant. And there are some other really great tools out there. There are honestly dozens of tools out there, so I just chose my two favorites to talk about today. The first one is the USDA Plants Database. They have tons of different plants, and you can kind of filter them out by your goals. And what I like about this for forest gardens in particular is that you can filter by growth habit. So you can see kind of in this picture, you can filter by growth habit, whether it's tree, shrub, subshrub, or vine. And so that's really helpful for forest gardens when we're thinking about what we might want in different vertical layers. Another great website that I love is Plants for a Future, which is just a nonprofit. And they have a database with 8,000 plus plants. And you can filter by edible uses or even by medicinal uses. So if you have a certain ailment that you are interested in providing a plant remedy for, you can filter by that. And you can also filter by ecosystem service. So we were mentioning, you might want to plant nitrogen fixing trees in your system. So with this tool, you can actually filter by plants that are nitrogen fixing. Or you can also filter by plants that provide a lot of shade or provide a windbreak function. So this is just a great tool to help you filter by your goals. And then local nurseries, they're just a great resource. Local nurseries always know exactly what varieties of species are best adapted to your area. So I always go to local nurseries. They really are a great wealth of knowledge. So now that we've talked about what species we want to plant, now it comes time to actually planting them and arranging them on our property. And there is no right or wrong way to do this in a forest garden. Really, the important thing to remember is just that you're going to have multiple vertical layers. That is the most important thing to think about, but how you actually plant them on the ground, there's no right or wrong answer. Typically, trees and shrubs are planted in either a grid pattern or a linear pattern. We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of those two different layouts. And then understory plants are kind of interspersed kind of randomly underneath the trees and the shrubs. So you could plant trees and shrubs in a grid pattern like we see up top. The benefits to this layout are that your trees are getting kind of even distribution of resources. So you can see they're evenly spaced, so they're getting even distribution of light and even distribution underground of resources like water and nutrients. So planting your trees like this is going to minimize your competition. So that's a good thing. But when we're thinking about community forest gardens and ease of access, it can be a little bit tough to walk through systems like this. You can see it's very dense. So it's kind of tough to get to, and it can also be tough to manage. Planting trees in rows in a linear pattern is a lot easier for ease of management. There are so many different management tasks that come with a forest garden, like pruning and weeding and harvesting and so many more tasks. They're very labor intensive. And so arranging your trees in a linear pattern is a little bit better in terms of just ease of management. So that's this picture below. And also, you know, if you have a community forest garden that you want to kind of function like a park, having pathways between rows of trees is just inviting for people. So I typically recommend planting trees in a linear pattern, but really anything goes. Another thing to think about when we're planting our forest gardens, this really applies to if your property's on a slope. If your property is on flat ground, you don't really need to worry about this. But if you are on a slope, you might have some runoff and erosion issues when it rains. So it's important to think about planting along the contour. And that basically means planting your trees and your shrubs in horizontal rows across the slope of a land, basically so that tree roots stabilize the soil in those areas. And if you're not sure about the contour of your land, another tool that I love is the U.S. Geological Survey. You can, again, type in your address and you can actually get the contour lines of your property. So again, this only applies to slope lands, but it's important to think about. So like we talked about, there are so many different considerations to think about when it comes to ecological design. The important thing is that we're trying to create an ecosystem that really functions as a whole, where everything's as in balance as it can be, where competition is minimized, and where synergistic interactions are maximized. So this picture here is an example of a forest garden that has really done a great job of that. This is the Festival Beach Food Forest in Austin, Texas. It was planted in 2015, so it's not very old, but it's already grown into this incredible abundance. And everything is really in balance. Everything does provide an ecological function, and it's producing a lot of food and a lot of benefit to the community. So this can just kind of show you what happens when we think about all of these different factors in our ecological design. And there are so many benefits in terms of increasing environmental resilience when we design food forests and forest gardens like this. We know that trees sequester a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and we know that that helps to fight climate change. Forest gardens are estimated to sequester up to 18 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year, and that's equivalent to the gas that it takes to drive 45,000 miles in an SUV. So there are huge environmental benefits to planting forest gardens in a community. Trees in forest gardens can also provide a lot of wildlife habitat for animals, for birds and bats and butterflies and all sorts of insects. And especially in urban areas, this is really important. In areas where there's a lot of concrete and where there's not much habitat, just having a little chunk of forest garden can be an incredible habitat that can support a lot of biodiversity. At the forest garden that I was helping to manage in San Diego, it was right in the middle of a big suburban area, and it was just 8 acres, and we actually were able to support an endangered species, the California gnatcatcher, just in that little area. So really, there are huge environmental benefits to having forest gardens. And trees can also help with phytoremediation. They can help clean up toxic soils. They can improve pest control, like we talked about, improve soil health, regulate the microclimate. This is also really important. Urban areas, typically, they have a lot of what we call the urban heat island effect. So we already have a lot of increased heat from climate change, but in urban areas, all the concrete and asphalt reflects heat, and it can just increase temperatures significantly. And that can have a lot of really harmful health implications for people and for the environment as a whole. And so planting trees, you can actually regulate the microclimate significantly and reduce temperatures by up to 15 degrees. So that has really big benefits for the environment. And then, like we touched on, there are some economic benefits. Forest gardens increase the productivity of a farming system by taking advantage of vertical space. They are very intensive from a management perspective, but when they are managed well, you can produce a lot of food in a small amount of acreage. So that's another benefit. So lots of ecosystem and social benefits come from forest gardens. And I want to stop there. Next, I'm going to be talking about kind of the community aspect of community forest gardens. Up to this point, we've just kind of talked about forest gardens. So if anyone has any questions up to this point, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks, Katherine. That was great. We have a few kind of practical questions that people have asked that I wanted to bring up. One is that you mentioned that forest gardens can provide important wildlife habitat and also food for humans. So how do you balance providing food for both of those?
That's a great question. So, there's that old saying, one for me, one for the bird, one for the bee. In forest gardens, typically, if a goal of yours is to produce food while also supporting wildlife, you're just going to have to expect that you're going to have some losses. And there are ways to minimize that. You can use things like gopher baskets to prevent damage from gophers. You can have rabbit baskets. You can have netting to prevent damage from birds. But if you're wanting to feed those kinds of animals, you can just not have those protection things in place. So it really depends on what your goals are, but there definitely are exclusionary tools that you can use if you're wanting to focus more on producing food for humans.
Thank you. Here's one more question. You talked about the ecological function of each layer of a forest garden, and someone is bringing up the concept of agroecology. And I wondered if you could speak to sort of how you see the connection between agroecology and agroforestry.
That is such a great question. This is definitely a form of agroecology because, the way I think about agroecology, it's kind of like a philosophy, a framework that we just think about when we're creating any type of farming system. And agroforestry systems specifically integrate trees, but they draw from these principles of agroecology, of looking at the system as a whole, of really trying to create an ecosystem that is not dependent on inputs, that's kind of a closed loop system. So yeah, they're definitely related. I would say that I kind of think about agroecology as the philosophy that informs different practices, and agroforestry is a type of practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. One more I'll ask you at this point. Someone was asking, do you have any input about planning for predicted climate changes in the area where you are when you're planning to try and create a forest garden? might you do something like adapt to planting more vegetation that's drought tolerant or flood resistant for any sort of expected changes in your area?
That is such a great question. Yeah, it can be really hard to plan for climate change because it can be so unexpected. Like, for example, I live in San Diego, and I have been planning for drought and wildfire and kind of orienting my landscape to be resilient against those expected climate changes. But we just got this tropical storm that came through. And so now I'm like, okay, so now I have to be prepared for flooding too. So it can be really, really hard to prepare for all of the different things that climate change might bring. And one of the things that I think is important is this concept of diversity. And that's something that is inherent to forest gardens. When you plant forest gardens, you've got a lot of different layers and a lot of different species. So no matter what, even if something happens that kills some of your plants in your system, it's not going to kill all the different species if you've got a diverse range of plants in your system. So I think diversity is really the best way to prepare for climate change in the future. But also definitely planting, like you said, if you live in a drought, in an area that experiences a lot of drought, plant drought resilient plants. Native plants are always a good way to go. They're well adapted to your area. And there are some tools for modeling climate change. I can follow up with a website. It's basically a climate change model, and you can see kind of predictions for the way climate change is expected to go in your area. It's all just predictions, but it can be a tool to kind of help you predict what's going to happen. But it's really tough. It's really tough. We're living in unprecedented times for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And yeah, a lot of people are asking for tools and resources, and I know you have a lot of those that you're going to share at the end. I wondered if you wanted to speak just for a moment about some of the urban agriculture, urban agroforestry tools you're working on now, and we'll share in the chat how people are going to be able to find those.
Yeah, definitely. So through a grant from the U.S. Botanic Gardens and the National Agroforestry Center, we got to create a lot of different resources for how to create forest gardens. And some of those, we created 11 videos. A lot of those videos are telling the stories of different forest gardens throughout the U.S. We also are going to have a really long publication that's kind of like a roadmap. It's like 30 pages with really in-depth considerations and things to think about for starting a forest garden in your area. We've also got a case study document talking about ways to find land if you're interested in starting forest gardens. Also, we've got a resource on different species for different areas. So we were able to create a lot of different resources thanks to USBG and the National Agroforestry Center. We're so grateful. So some of those resources are online now at atra.ncat.org. And we can put a link to that in the chat. And then we've got more resources that are going to be ready by September 30th. So there's a lot out there. And then there are a lot of other resources that are out there. Some of the tools that I mentioned in the presentation, and then other tools as well. So we can kind of create a list and send that out. But the good thing is there are definitely lots of tools out there for folks who are interested.
Perfect. Thanks, Catherine. And yeah, we shared that link in the chat, and we'll share a few more resources toward the end of the program today. So we'll pause here with questions and let you continue with the second, more practical part of the presentation.
Awesome. Okay, well, we talked about forest gardens, and now we're going to talk about the community aspect. So forest gardens could be planted anywhere, but when they're planted in communities, there are so many benefits that can come from them. And the important thing to remember is that, when we're implementing them in communities, it's important to remember that they should be stewarded by the community and they should be for the community. And you can implement them in so many different areas. It could be on public parkland, on empty lots, on private property that's open to the public at certain times of the day. They could be in community land trusts that are owned by the collective. They could be at churches or in schools, really anywhere. But there are a lot of different benefits that can come to a community when they are implemented. And we've kind of touched on some of these, how trees can improve the urban heat island effect. They can alleviate that. They can increase food security. A forest garden is not going to produce, all the food that a community might need or a family might need, but they definitely can provide some supplemental nutrition, and can increase people's connection to nature, especially in urban areas where there's, it's hard to find areas where there's just a lot of nature. And so forest gardens can be that connection to nature that is really good for humans. Trees have been documented to have mental health benefits for humans and also physical health benefits even. Just being in proximity to trees can actually lower blood pressure, which is incredible. And so having a forest garden in a community, it's a community asset that really can have a lot of health benefits, mental health benefits, and benefits for nourishing relationships between neighbors and people as well. Karen Lucius is a plant steward. She's the plant steward at the Festival Beach Food Forest in Austin, Texas. And she put it really beautifully. So I'm just going to quote her. She said that forest gardens are a community of plants and they're a community of people. So, it's important to remember that the defining feature of a forest garden is its diversity, right? And that applies to the plants and it also applies to people. Forest gardens are a place where diverse people from all walks of life can come together, work alongside one another, learn together, and grow together and nourish those relationships. It's all about the relationships, and it's all about that diversity in that community. So now we can talk about the steps for starting a forest garden in your area. Number one, the most important thing to start any project is planning. There's that adage, measure twice, cut once. You always want to observe and interact before you start any project. And when it comes to community forest gardens, it's really important that the planning and decision-making process is done by the people who will be interacting with the space. The number one most important prerequisite for ensuring the sustainability of a community forest garden is making sure that the community is involved, making sure that you're planting things that the community wants to see, making sure that the community wants the forest garden at all. So getting their feedback and input is really, really important. And there's so many ways to do this. This photo here is the Tamok Tulum Food Forest in San Antonio. And they had a really great idea. They put these signs up all throughout the city. And the signs had a QR code with a link to a survey where people could anonymously input things that they wanted to see in the forest garden. So they were able to put in plants that they wanted to see and other features that they wanted to see. And then they were able to design the food forest based off of this community input. The Festival Beach Food Forest in Austin, they used potlucks as a tool to gauge community interest. They just started bringing bread and soup and salad to parks on a weekly basis, and people started coming and kind of organically talking about what they wanted to see in a forest garden. And that's how that forest garden came to be. You could also do anonymous brainstorming. A lot of times people don't want to speak up to give input. So you could just, have people write down ideas on a piece of paper and put it in a hat. There are just so many ways you could do this, but the important thing is to get that community input. And then when it comes to decision-making, there are a lot of decision-making models that are out there for, making equitable decisions. There are just a few listed here. We're not going to have time to go into all of them, but the important thing is making sure that everybody has a voice. Of course, when it comes to implementing any project, you're going to want to evaluate your goals and make sure that whatever you're proposing in your forest garden is addressing a problem. So, for example, a primary goal could be wanting to produce a lot of food for your community. And in that case, you would, choose a lot of plants that are primarily food producing. If your primary goal is to provide a place for the community to gather, you might consider implementing other features like picnic tables or a stage where you could have music, things like that. But no matter what, just make sure that you are designing your forest garden to address your goals. Inventorying your resources is always important. Resources could include your financial resources, your land, or even just things like knowledge that exists in the community. People's passions or hidden talents, skills, all of those things count as resources that you can use to form your forest garden. And then finding land is super important. Of course, you cannot have a forest garden if you don't have land, but there are a lot of different creative ways that you can obtain land for relatively low costs. Not always, but sometimes. So I'm just going to kind of talk about some of the things that I've seen through the course of this project, ways that people have obtained land. You could lease or buy private land. This is an expensive option, but there are property tax incentives in some counties if you're producing agriculture on your land. So that's something to think about. Leasing or buying city or county land is also an option. Oftentimes, your city owns parcels of land that are underutilized. They might not be developable. And so sometimes it costs the city a lot of money to maintain that land. And they might be eager to kind of relinquish the management of it. So you can talk to your Department of Development or your Parks and Recreation Department or even your Watershed Protection Department to see if there are any parcels of land that are underutilized, kind of marginalized, that the city might be willing to lease to you or even sell to you for a low cost. So an example of this is the Grow Enrichment Food Forest in Nashville, Tennessee. They went to their Parks and Rec department in Nashville, and they found this piece of parkland that really wasn't being utilized. They asked the city if they could take it over, take over the management of it, the maintenance of it. And the city was like, yeah, absolutely. We don't want to spend money managing that underutilized piece of land. And so they are actually leasing it to Grow Enrichment for just $1 a year. So there are definitely things that you can do to get affordable land. Another example of a community actually buying city land is the Boston Food Forest Coalition. This is an incredible coalition of food forests in the Boston metropolitan area. And right now there are 10 food forests, but they're looking to expand. And their sort of model is they go to the Department of Development, they see if there are any plots of land that are not able to be developed, and they see if the city of Boston will sell that land. And they've been able to buy a lot of land and actually put it into a community land trust so that it is owned by the collective. And that's an incredible way to ensure that a community food forest is going to continue into perpetuity. So their model is just great, super, super inspiring. But there are lots of other ways that you could obtain land. Again, you could put a forest garden on church land, in neighborhood common spaces, and even in schools. The Miami-Dade Public School District is a great example. They have implemented forest gardens in 26 of their elementary schools. And it's just incredible. These forest gardens are functioning like outdoor classrooms. They're producing a lot of food that the kids get to take home with them or that are used in, lunches at the schools. So, they're an incredibly inspiring story, but there are definitely a lot of different ways that you can find land if you're wanting to do this. And ATRA is going to have a resource on this as well that you can look into. No matter what, it's important to be aware of your city's ordinances and regulations before you start a project. Cities often have regulations around zoning, where you're allowed to sell. There might be regulations around how many animals you can have, if you're allowed to have permanent structures like greenhouses and restrooms. So it's just things to be aware of. But definitely, if there are regulations that you're coming up against, it's worth it to talk to your municipality to see if you can modify some of those regulations or change them. Oftentimes, cities want to see urban agriculture projects, and so they might be willing to create special use permits or just loopholes for projects. And a lot of times, cities also have resources that they might be able to provide to a project. Sometimes there are resources like mulch. Like, for example, the city of Austin, they did a series of different community orchards that were planted along a floodplain. And the city actually provided a lot of the trees that were planted. They can provide mulch, they can provide seeds, they can provide weed control services like mowings of grass. So it's definitely worth it to talk to your city to see if there might be some resources that they would be willing to contribute to an urban agroforestry project. It's definitely good to think about utilities. If you're in an urban area, you're going to have utilities below and above ground. Always call the 811 call before you dig hotline so that you make sure you're not running into any underground utilities like gas lines or water lines. And then, of course, soils in urban areas, they tend to be a little bit more at risk of being toxic just because of all the different contaminants that are in urban areas. So definitely it's worth doing a soil test before starting a project. And then if you do find a lot of contamination, I wouldn't give up on the project. The EPA can help you remediate soil. And a lot of urban areas aren't highly contaminated, so it's pretty rare that you'd have to go to the EPA. But they are a great resource if your soil was highly contaminated. And then, of course, community engagement. Once you get your project off the ground, there are so many different things that you can do to bring the community to your site, to engage them and educate them. You can have volunteer work days where people come and learn by doing. You could have plant identification walks to kind of teach people about the various plants that are in the forest garden. You could have U-picks. You could have foraging days or community feasts. I've seen workshops that are done in forest gardens. I've even seen music festivals that are done, activities like yoga in the forest. Grow Enrichment in Nashville, they host a lot of school field trips. So there are just so many different things that you could do to bring the community to a forest garden. The important thing is bringing people together. So like I mentioned, throughout this project, I got to talk to about 12 different forest gardens throughout the country, but there are dozens more. There are so many who have successfully done it, and you can too. And so like I mentioned, there are lots of resources if you're wanting to learn more. And right now, I think we have 5 minutes left for questions. If you have any questions for how to implement these types of systems.
Thanks so much, Katherine. Yeah, we've had a lot of good questions come in. Here's one I'd like to ask you. You talked about the importance of engaging the community in planning a forest garden, which is awesome. How do you continue to communicate once a forest garden is established? Somebody commented that they think our biggest task is really communicating the benefits of a system and making sure that people know what's available if it's meant to be used for community benefit.
That is such a good question. It's so important, yeah, to constantly be communicating with the community. And a lot of times that's hard. Things that I've seen that have worked pretty well are signs, welcoming signs at a forest garden to let people know what it is, to let people know that it's public, that people are welcome there. Social media is a really great tool. I've seen forest gardens like the Lawrence Community Orchard in Kansas City. They do a great job of using their social media to let people know what's ripe and what's harvestable in a forest garden. Definitely going to your community, maybe city planning meetings and other city meetings that are going on to just tell people about your forest garden, and then hosting events. So hosting festivals, hosting workshops, hosting things like yoga or just activities can let people know that they're welcome in a space. And then, when it comes to continued decision making, there are lots of different models that you can use to make sure that you're continually making decisions in an equitable way. The Festival Beach Food Forest uses a model called sociocracy or dynamic governance, where anyone who's involved in the food forest, there are different teams that they get to work with to kind of provide input and feedback and be part of the decision-making process. But there are lots of different models that you could use for that. The important thing is just to make sure that you're always listening to people and engaging with them.
Thanks, Katherine. Yeah, and it's important to really take the time for that. And somebody was asking a question about time. From idea to planting, how long can they expect it to take to research, create, and implement a forest garden in their community?
That is such a great question. There's no real answer to that question. It's going to depend. It's going to depend on whether you already have land or whether you need to obtain it. It can take a really long time to obtain land or to enter into a shared use land agreement if you're working with your city or your county. Especially if you are working with your city or your county, it can take a few years. And then, it's always recommended to take a long time to intentionally plan and design a forest garden before you actually break ground. So that could be, about a year of just sitting with the land, getting that community feedback, making sure you've reached all stakeholders. So this could be like a 1 to 3 year process, or less, if you already have land, but it's a lengthy process, but it's worth it. It's worth it to take that time and do it right.
Thank you. We had a few questions about design, and especially if people are interested in including annuals in a forest garden. How do you do that? How do you sort of make sure that trees are situated in a way to not block the growth of those? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. It's definitely good to also incorporate annuals into a forest garden. They can kind of have everything. The perennials, that's kind of the backbone of the structure of a forest garden, but you can intersperse annuals anywhere. And a lot of times annual root systems they're going to have a little bit shallower roots while trees have really, really deep roots. And so that's helpful. You're not going to have a lot of niche overlap when you plant annuals next to perennials. So I'm trying to kind of show with my hands. Imagine this is an annual root system. This is a perennial root system. The tree's root system is going to be utilizing resources, nutrients, water from deeper underground, while the annual is going to use kind of more shallow resources. So they are not going to, there is going to be competition, but there's going to be less competition than if you were to have 2 perennials side by side or 2 annuals side by side. But it definitely depends. I say try it out. If you plant a tree and you plant an annual next to it and it works, that's great. If it doesn't produce, you might want to try spacing it out a little bit further. There's a lot of trial and error when it comes to forest gardens.
Thanks, Katherine. We have a lot of people loving your slides, and a lot of people loving the resources that you've been talking about. And so we will share a way to contact Katherine, and we will share these links to the resources, some of the resources that she's mentioned in the chat. And then people will be able to refer back to this session as well when we post the recordings. Just want to make sure that people see that. But I wanted to ask you specifically about like regionally specific resources. And do you want to speak to what some of the variations might be and where people can go for regionally specific support?
Yeah, absolutely. So ATRA, we're coming out with a resource, again, funded by USBG and NAC, with different species that forest gardens in 7 different growing regions have used, and some of the considerations for what it's like to implement a forest garden in those different growing regions. So we've explored 7 different growing regions. There are so many more, but we did what we could. And then definitely some of those resources that I kind of went through in the first half of the presentation, where you can enter in your address to get info about your specific site. Those are really, really great resources for getting to know what your specific climate's needs are and what species are going to work well in your area. And then, it's my job to answer questions about forest gardens and to help people implement them. So please, please, please do reach out to me. I'll provide my phone number and my email, but it really is, it's my job to help. So I would love, a phone call if anyone has questions. I really think, forest gardens are they're an incredible community asset. And I think it'd be beautiful if every community throughout the country had an asset like this. So that's the goal. And yeah, happy to help answer questions.
Thanks, Catherine. And we are getting just to the end of our time here. So I wanted to just end with one final question for you, which is when you think about the future of urban agroforestry, what excites you the most?
Yeah, I'm excited by the possibility of ecosystems like this being in every city across the country. I do think there could be a place for them, just like we have parks in just about every community throughout the country. Parks are a normal thing. What if we normalized forest gardens? What if this kind of ecosystem became common? There would be habitat for wildlife. There would be so many community benefits for humans and for the environment as a whole. And it's something that I think is possible. So I'm excited for that kind of future.